Good evening. You have reached the No Name Cinema Society, the film review show that digs a little deeper. And this is episode 55.2, our indie spotlight of the film Every Little Step. Hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan Betzler. I'm one of your hosts here this evening. Emma's here to join me as well. And yes, throughout the year 2019, we are looking back and spotlighting indies from 10 years ago. So 2009, all the films, indie spotlights we're going to do this year. We're releasing the film of the year 2009. And tonight we're going to spotlight the Broadway documentary, Every Little Step. And, you know, it's appropriate then that I would have a Broadway expert on the show with us. And we've got one ginger here. Here's the other. James Monahan is here.
Hey, everybody. I don't know if I'm an expert, but I do work in an industry that covers Broadway, so I know a little something about a little something.
On the other side of things, I've got someone who's never seen a Broadway show in his life, Patrick Taylor.
This is true. Never seen a Broadway show in person in my life.
I didn't talk about with them in advance. I just had a feeling that he's never actually seen a show.
Yeah, that was a very intuitive feeling.
I mean, I know my people. All right, so here's the schedule for this set of episodes, or 55 set of episodes. Of course, tonight is our indie spotlight, Every Little Step. We're going to do the classic Western, The Wild Bunch. And on Monday, we will do our 39th Sound Off, in which I'm going to do a book review. Devin and I will recast some of the films we wanted to remake from 1988, and I'm count down my top 5 Westerns made in the 1960s. So that's what we got coming up in this set of episodes. Time for me to start drinking a little Jameson's. I usually drink alone. Sometimes Patrick will join me. Patrick, are you with me on this stuff here?
You know, I have nothing to drink, unfortunately, but I do have some Gatorade, so I might go there.
Oh, wow. All right. Stronger than I remembered. Okay.
Some hair on your chest.
Our trivia from the last episode said we were going back to the world of documentaries where we go behind the scenes of an old/new Broadway musical. And the reason it's old/new is because Every Little Step is about the legendary musical Chorus Line, both the 2006 revival and the 1975/76 originals in the 1975-76 Broadway season. This is the 5th documentary we've done in the show. Previous documentaries that we've done include 10,000 Days on Earth, The Interrupters, How to Survive a Plague, and The Square, all of which we've reviewed on this show. But I don't think either of these guys were a part of those shows. So this is the first documentary for you guys. But James, you had a couple documentaries in your top 10 this past year.
Yes, and Free Solo, which was in my top 10, ended up winning Best Documentary at the Oscars.
That's months ago now. I mean, get over it. Won't You Be My Neighbor, which was also in your top 10, wasn't even nominated. So who's the measure by the Academy anymore?
Right. They're completely meaningless, right?
Anyway, all right. So you guys ready for the summary?
Yeah.
It's a pretty easy film to summarize. Every Little Step takes us behind the scenes of the audition process for the revival of the beloved show, A Chorus Line. And in doing so, also reveals the development process back in the mid-70s. The way we do indie spotlights is one of us usually recommends them, almost like a dissertation. We make our case, and then the others give, their thoughts. And this is my recommendation, and it made my top 10 in 2009. I admit that I have perhaps what is an extreme personal connection with this movie, and James may as well. My ex-girlfriend was and is a Broadway person, and it's a very small community. So this is a documentary which I know several of the people personally, and James may as well. And I was invited to a private preview of it back in February 2009, and Marvin Hamlish, the composer of The Chorus Line, was in the room just a few years before his death. I love this film, and I may be biased, but it's hard to say that for sure, and maybe these guys will set me straight. I personally think it's an extremely well-made and underappreciated documentary. The film has a narrow focus of sorts on this audition process, which prevented it from getting too unwieldy, but as the best documentaries do, in spite of that narrow focus, I think it reveals so much. Enlightening, heartbreaking, and inspiring, not only about this weird little Broadway world, but about the artistic process in general. So, guys, before I assigned you guys to watch this movie, have you heard of it before?
No, I never heard of it.
Yes, I had seen it actually previously.
You had seen it before. Okay. Patrick, had you heard of A Chorus Line?
No, I had not. I didn't know all the characters to know what I was missing. It just seemed like a crazy audition process to get these coveted roles.
Was it clear to you that it was the musical that it's based on? Was it clear to you that it's sort of legendary within the Broadway world?
It became very clear to me.
Clear that the musical itself is an audition. It's about an audition. Every Little Step is about the audition process, but the musical itself, the story of the musical, is an audition.
Stories about auditioning experiences that these people have had.
No, the actual show is an audition.
And that makes sense too. Like, some of the numbers, right?
So it's interesting that was not clear.
I knew Chorus Line very well. I actually was in it in high school.
James and I are coming at this from a totally different perspective, which leads me to opening thoughts. And I guess it makes sense for Patrick to go first. How does this documentary land with you without having any previous knowledge?
It felt like a very relatable thing because everybody's like kind of thrown their resume into LinkedIn's kind of. It felt like the resume process in the modern era where you're throwing your resume in with 1,000 people and you get called in, and you get called and then you don't get the part or you don't get the job. So it just felt like, and I'm also a musician where it's like the creative process, just because someone doesn't like your music doesn't mean that you should lose work. I could relate to it a lot. So I like it.
Yeah, well, that's cool that even though without knowing what a chorus line was or the significance of it, you were able to still connect to it. So that's a real positive to me. James, what did you think?
Yeah, well, I just thought it was a very revealing, it was kind of two films in one, very revealing behind the scenes look, thanks to some incredible access to the audition process and to archival footage, looking at these highly competitive auditions, but also, as you said, the creative process behind one of Broadway's classics. And I would actually say it's one of America's classics in terms of just a dramatic work of art.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate the movie itself was such a dud, or else I think it would be a little more well-known outside of the Broadway community. You talk to people in the street about the classic Broadway musicals, and they're more likely to talk about Sound of Music or West Side Story because the movies have resonated, whereas a Chorus Line movie didn't land so well. And it's a hard show to do a movie of. It's like it's Broadway's own thing. The thing that lands for me really with this movie is the structure of it. It's the perfect storm for a documentary about auditioning because of the meta quality, an expose of an audition process for a musical that's about an audition. Notably, with some of the team from the original show are involved with this production. So that was adding to this meta quality. The key to the movie to me is the cross-cutting between the modern day auditions and the development process and the way those two trains sort of move concurrently in the movie. We see the evolution of the creation of the characters and then the modern interpretation of them. Not only did that flow beautifully in terms of the structure of the documentary, but it really hit home to me about how art is created, starting from a very nebulous germ of an idea from Michael Bennett and becoming one of the most well-known pieces of theater of all time. Those tapes, by the way, are gold. What amazing material those archival tapes are of that session in 1974. James, what do you think about this structure?
Yeah, well, you mentioned earlier it could have been more unwieldy if they covered more of the scope of this revival production, but was already quite a task to put kind of these two narratives together and weave them together and not have it tax your patience. They mentioned the first workshop of A Chorus Line being really tough because they went through each of these characters one by one, and it was terrible. It was just boring. And they kind of had to make the same kind of choices in this documentary. You know, they did kind of go in a linear fashion, going character by character, but they had to make sure they didn't dwell too long on one particular character. And the meshing of these two narratives, it could have gone really wrong too. I think one of the advantages they had was Marvin Hamlish's amazing score, which, since, as you mentioned, this is a meta show about putting together a show and the audition process, all of those songs related to the contemporary audition scenes. Yeah. So you could see the dancers getting ready to audition, and you could hear the Hamlish score going, God, I hope I get it. Yeah. I hope I get it. And that really helped glue the two narratives together.
Patrick, how do you feel about this structure of seeing the modern auditions and the archival stuff at the same time?
I was really kind of watching for the modern auditions. That was my main storyline because I didn't have that past connection with the original play. So I was looking at when they cut to the original audition tapes or some of the other stuff. It's kind of ways to inform how the actors should be acting.
Oh,
so it's kind of like a cheat sheet. When the guy was crying about his father never calling him son, we kind of got how his role paralleled with the guy who was originally cast. So I was watching for that. And that was really nice to see how these people were judging these auditioners against what it was originally there. I thought that was great just as like background to understand where these actors were coming from and how they were trying to differentiate themselves.
Did you get something about how A Chorus Line was put together? Like, what do you think about this idea that he gathered 12 dancers in his apartment and recorded them, and that became a Broadway musical?
That was pretty cool. Seeing like how the play began, it was very interesting. But again, I didn't know it was a huge Broadway musical. Just understanding that how creative it is to like kind of just say, you know, I think my friends are really cool. I'm going to document this and then find stories out of this one night of conversation. And then it becomes something that everyone wants to be a part of 30 years later. It's great. It's like America. It's like you can make it something out of nothing.
I found it particularly inspiring. I do have some quibbles about the structure. I think James might disagree with me. As much as I love the film, it has a bit of a rose-colored glasses quality to it. I mean, I think, James and I both know that as supporting and loving a community as Broadway can be, it can also be extremely catty and vicious, which we only got to see slight glimpses of, for which I was grateful for, because I think it rounded out the film a little bit. I mean, to some degree, it's okay because I already know that that's there, and actors, for the most part, would never have shown that dark side on camera willingly. But it would have made, I think, a more complete and thorough portrait if we got to see a little bit more of that. And also, the film did not dare explore the dark side of Michael Bennett himself, who, like many geniuses, was something of a self-destructive megalomaniac, a fascinating figure in the history of Broadway. Granted, his worst days were more towards his Dreamgirls days, but this film falls just short of canonizing him. I think the film could have been served with a slightly more complete picture of this complicated man, and I don't want to devote too much the film screen time to that, but I would have liked a little bit more color, especially with the Michael Bennett stuff. I felt like he was put on a pedestal a little too much throughout the movie. Like, it's a great piece of work for sure, but there's more to it. James, I had a feeling you were going to disagree.
I do disagree that involving more information about Michael's career outside of this show would have muddied the waters. We already have two narratives to deal with here. The focus of this film is about this particular show and, of course, this particular revival audition. And that's plenty. And it's interesting, talking here to Patrick, who's someone who doesn't know the show, because it brings up the question of, if we didn't have the other half of this film talking about the development of the show, would it have been a compelling film? And I have to say, I think it would have been still pretty good. I'm curious what they left on the cutting room floor, because this falls under the most tried and true subgenre of documentary filmmaking in existence. More than half of the reality shows, aka documentaries on TV, are competition shows. And that's what this audition show is. From Big Brother to The Bachelor to American Idol, these are all competition shows, kind of similar to this. So I think it could have been a compelling film even without the creative development of the original.
I kind of disagree. American Idol, you know that they're about to win a record contract with somebody that you know.
What really matters is what's important to the characters in the movie. To these people that are auditioning for this process, a role in a Broadway show, particularly something with this it's a high profile kind of thing, that to them, they might trade for the record contract. They might rather have the Broadway show. It's their dream.
And that makes for a compelling show, but just like a pop culture kind of a success.
I understand about the Michael Bennett thing. I don't want to complicate the movie more. I want them to acknowledge the dark side a little bit. I didn't want to hammer that point home. It's a minor quibble, and I don't think I wanted too much time devoted to it. I just wanted it to be acknowledged at least a little bit. Do you see my point about it feeling like it was a little rose-colored at times, bordering on propaganda for the Broadway world?
I think they definitely colored running out of money. Thank God this opportunity came when it did. They didn't really show the people who ran out of unemployment or had no money, who actually needed this job and didn't get the job. And I feel like they did show a little bit of the narcissism. And that one guy at the very end, I see myself a star of a show, but he didn't get the part.
It's very visceral how it depicts the life of an actor.
I know your point, and that was why I wonder if the whole thing would have been about the audition, and maybe it would have been better as like a TV series. I think a lot of people would watch a TV show that tracks the audition.
Well, they had those police auditions. Yeah. That's where we got. Right. Oh, I forgot her name already. Laura Osnes. She won the Grease.
Oh, yeah.
There was a reality show about a Broadway audition. Yeah. It was for Grease.
Right.
And Laura Osnes won, and then now she's a Broadway star.
No. I've interviewed her plenty of times. I thought there was a little more darkness, at least, in this film. And Patrick pointed out the guy who auditions for Mike. I thought he was a great character, really cocky. If the whole thing was about the auditions, I would love to see these more in the hallway waiting moments that we just got peeks of in this film. For example, that guy, Mike, who's auditioning for Mike, comes out, and he was projecting this cockiness, right? He's like, I'm not desperate. I do what I want to do, and the rest is whatever. And of course, not to spoil too much, but that cockiness comes back to bite him in the butt later in the film. I was blown away by the access given to these filmmakers because I have never been given access to auditions, because obviously these performers, they don't want to see their warts and all, you know, which come out in auditions, portray to everyone. And also the unions will have a problem with it. So someone pulled a lot of favors.
And the very first thing in this movie is a thanks to actor equity. The very first thing that comes up. Part of the promotion of the show, what they didn't realize is the show would be closed by the time the movie came out. You know, this world where they'd see each other at the auditions and like, oh, you did great, whatever. And then I know anyway, that they walk out the door and they're like, she sucked, you know, she wore the wrong bra today. There's a ton of that sort of falseness. It just would have been really interesting to see that sort of duplicity that I know exists. It's competition, to your point, and sometimes it gets a little bloodthirsty.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we do get these glimpses of insecurity, of course, which is ever present amongst actors. You have a girl coming out of the Val audition saying, you know, I was awful, blah, blah. But then she finds out she got it, so she brightens up right away.
And they all say that too, especially as they're coming out to the room where the other actors are. They put other actors at ease. Like, by saying that how bad they were. Let's push on to talk a little bit about the editing. You know, sometimes in the show we talk about the two types of editing: the overall editing of a story, sort of modifying the structures of a piece, but the other kind of editing, this film does just as well. What I call in-scene editing, moving from shot to shot within the same scene, creating sequences with energy and meaning. In this movie, it also manages to show us both sides of the audition table: the actors and the auditioners within a sequence, so we get a well-rounded view of what's going on. I think the dance montages are fabulous, especially when they utilize some of the vintage material and cross-cut back and forth between 1970s dancing and 2005 dancing or 2006. The sound editing must have been a nightmare. I think they did a terrific job with that, cutting together the same song with different voices from sound that was probably captured pretty much on the fly. From a technical point of view, it was extraordinary work. The editors were Brad Fuller and Fernando Villena. I think they did a terrific job. What must have been a very arduous task. James, you're an editor. You guys both are, but James, am I on point here?
Yeah, I thought it was very well crafted. And like I mentioned earlier, I thought the glue was this music, the real score.
Patrick, what do you think about the actual editing?
I was wrapped up in it. You know, nothing drew me away from it. And I also like movies that kind of just drop you in at certain times. You know, like there's no like, they're like 4 months later, last audition, and you just felt like, okay, something exciting is about to happen because this is when they started the next timeline. I liked their editing, but nothing was like, nothing messed me up. Nothing took me out of the show. I was completely wrapped up in it. So that meant the editing was good. Right.
And the other thing I wanted to talk about is the good documentaries do is character creation, how they sort of set up and follow characters. And I think the first thing is, well, let's start with balance, because I do think that because James already mentioned it, it does seem to have just the right balance between all the auditionees that it follows. Jessica and Charlotte got maybe a little more backstory mixed in, but that seemed appropriate because Jessica was the rags to riches story in the movie, and Charlotte was the established star at this point, which Patrick had no way of knowing that Charlotte D'Amboise was already sort of a known quantity within that Broadway world. But I think the film allows the actors themselves to tell their own stories. It didn't feel overly manipulative in telling you who to root for. I mean, we got to see the auditions ourselves. So as a director, I rooted for those that I thought were the best. And it was pretty clear to me. In that sense, I felt a part of the process. And they made almost the same exact choices as I would, save for one. Patrick, how do you feel about the balance of the characters?
I thought they were even-handed. I didn't feel like one person had more of a story than another. I did feel like I knew less about the Black character than probably the other two. I was more thinking of it like it's a competition show. We're going to learn more and more about these characters as the pyramid grows with less people.
James, you brought this up first. Do you want to expound?
Yeah, well, the filmmakers had quite a task choosing who to put the spotlight on and then when to show them in the film. You mentioned Jessica, she's shown early in the film, but you notice they save Charlotte D'Amboise, who eventually gets, well, let's not spoil it, but she's the one auditioning for Cassie. They save her to the end, and they go into her backstory being the daughter of Jacques D'Amboise, famous dancer. We get to know him as well. So
Which I think
I
was
wonder.
crucial for theme of the movie. At first, it seemed like a sidetrack, but I think it was actually really on point.
So I'm curious how many times the structure of this film changed in the editing room.
It wound up feeling right, though. I will say this much. I won't say who got cast, but I would have cast Cassie different. It was close, but I would have cast Cassie differently.
I don't know. I kind of agreed with all of them, actually.
Agreed with all of them.
I actually, you know what? The cocky guy who didn't get Mike, I actually might have cast him.
You like the wild card element.
Yeah.
Patrick, are we happy with the final cast?
I was happy with them.
Okay. Are you guys ready for the theme segment?
Beans.
All right, it's time for the T word. We call it the T word because Davey used to be afraid of the word themes, and now it's just a thing. I've got two themes, and they're fairly basic. We alluded to them before. One of the themes is the life of an artist. And for me, this film really highlights the sacrifices, the hope, and the heartaches that we go through. It vividly shows that it's not a choice that we make to do this. It's a calling. Whether you're an actor, a dancer, a singer, a filmmaker, a painter, a writer, a sculptor, a photographer, you're not you unless you're doing this thing to try and move, please, and provoke other people with your stories. That hit home for me in a visceral way with this film. Patrick, you sort of alluded to this earlier. It sounded like that's what you got out of it as well.
Yeah, it's definitely a vocation. It's definitely art as a calling, and it's painful. I've been at the other side of being selected for a job, and then it doesn't work out, and they have to go in another direction. This whole world feels like something that an artist can completely relate to.
Actors are almost a little bit hard about any of our other disciplines because how you look is just as important as how talented you are. Because we can make any sort of film that we want to make, but we can't play every role. We have to be sort of the right age, the right look. That's always the trickiest thing about being an actor. James, the life of an artist.
I'd extend it beyond that. Why does this film just have to be about artists? I think it's about all of us who have dreams and passions, and it's about the pluses and minuses of sticking with those dreams and passions, no matter what happens, and dealing with what's in your control and what's out of your control. Natasha, one of the women auditioning for Cassie, says, "I want to spend the rest of my life on this earth dancing. This is the best of me." The question comes up most compellingly in A Chorus Line, the musical, with Cassie, I think, because she has what it takes, at least in the eyes of the director, to be a Broadway star. But that's not what she wants. She wants to dance and be in the chorus. So it's about following exactly what she wants, no matter what anyone else says. We thought maybe the guy auditioning for Mike was totally cocky, but we can totally see that at least he's happy and he's at peace with himself no matter what happens. And you can imagine that what he says is true. Whether he gets the part or not, he's going to keep on doing what he loves.
I agree with you saying it's inspiring regardless of what our dreams are. I totally get that. But I do think that there is something in this movie that hits home with me about there is something unique about being an artist, about any type of artist, in the sense that those of us that do it feel like we shouldn't be doing anything else. And it's almost religious. There's a lot of great jobs people have that I don't know requires that sort of religious fervor and faith. There's faith in being an artist, faith in, eating ramen noodles for a year when you're struggling. It's unusual in terms of a vocation.
Well, my grandfather-in-law was an accountant, and he was like one of the most passionate people about his job I've ever met in my life. I think Bob Aving at the end of this documentary sums up the theme as well, echoing the song, What I Did for Love. He's like, this is what the show is about. What we did for love. That's why I like the show. It encompasses both pluses and minuses because it involves sacrifices in your lives. And I think what you're speaking to is the unique position that actors, especially as artists, are in, because they are on the low totem pole in terms of power. And also when they go into these job interviews, basically, it feels like they're being judged on themselves as a totality oftentimes. Here there are so many intangibles about casting somebody that often the judgment is made on a gut decision.
To the point that Bob Aving made, and we've all experienced this, I think I even mentioned it to you, James, people are cut when they walk in the door. They don't get to say a word. They walk in and they're wrong. And they didn't do anything bad. They're just not right for that particular role, and you know it in your gut. Sometimes it's just the way you walk in a room and the way you first present yourself. So it is very tricky for an actor. The other theme that I had, as we get close to wrapping things up here, is, art itself. I love this idea of a guy gathering a group of friends in his apartment, recording their stories, and then making art out of it. And how that piece of art change the lives of some of the people that experienced it, the eventual musical, inspiring some of the people that would wind up getting a chance to be in the reboot. It's also interesting how fickle art can be, how changing the title of a song or ending the play in a minor way can affect its reception in a major fashion. This film tracks the germ of an idea, showed how it turned into a digestible, enjoyable piece of art, how that became a classic, and how that legacy can live on from a meeting that took a few hours in an apartment building in 1974. It's inspiring because it reminds me of what's possible if you have the daring to dream a little and the balls to try and execute that dream. So that's the other thing that I took from this movie, not just about the being of artists, but about the creation of art itself. Patrick, the composer.
We're lucky enough to live in a place where this is possible. I mean, a lot of places it's not. And you can take a kernel of an idea and work your ass off and flesh it out, and it can become sensational, or it can become a flop. The fact that he gotten the opportunity to have this workshop, to write something and then have the space to edit it and make it into something better. It was motivational, but I know this doesn't happen for everyone, but it can happen, and that's why probably a lot of these people want to be a part of this.
Yeah, James.
I have to say, there's so many like competition documentaries out there that the most compelling part of this film to me was the other half, which was about the creative development of this project. I mean, a lot of people think like creations just arrive, ready-made out of no. There's a lot of work, there's a lot of effort put into this stuff. And I love the revealing little nuggets from how Neil Simon's wife saved the end of the musical to how they...
I mean, who's an Oscar-nominated actress in her own right?
Sorry, I didn't know that.
Marsha Mason is a 2 or 3 time Oscar-nominated actress.
Okay, my bad. I'm sorry. So how Marsha Mason saved the end of the show, to how they fixed a gag that had been ruined by the program, to how in the early stages they fixed this from becoming a completely boring mess by creating that montage at the ballet. These little nuggets are really like exciting to me, kind of behind the scenes of expertise, because I really admire the amount of talent out there. And everyone you see in the final levels of the audition in this film, they're at the top of their game, and even if they get cut. I mean, it's a real fun exercise to go, and there have been articles written about where are they now, just a couple of years ago, where are the people in this documentary now? And you can do a little more.
Do you have specific questions? Because I know some of the people.
A great double feature with this film is the documentary, The Best Worst Thing That Ever Could Have Happened, which is about the making of the classic musical Merrily We Roll Along by Stephen Sondheim. And this is a show that only lasted a couple of nights.
But it's still a classic, Patrick. It's still a classic.
Did it fail, or was it only billed for a couple of nights?
It failed. And it became a cult classic. And actually, right now, you can go off Broadway. The Roundabout Theater is doing a great production of Merrily We Roll Along. Fantastic. I highly recommend it if you're in New York.
Also, Moon Over Broadway is another behind the scenes of the play. Moon Over Buffalo is another Broadway behind the scenes documentary. And also, there was a documentary about the all-night recording session of Company.
That's recently been parodied.
Documentary
so, yeah, that's another one. It's pretty funny. There's an Easter egg in this film I want to point out for Broadway fans.
I have one too. I hope it's not the same one.
If you go to 54 minutes, 54 seconds, they're going through Polaroids. They're going through Polaroids and saying, no, this guy didn't make
it. What I had! Damn you!
Sorry. It's Andy Blankenbuehler,
who is now a 3-time Tony-winning choreographer,
including the choreographer for Hamilton.
Damn it! I thought you would never notice that.
I gotcha, JB.
They pulled up his name. I'm like, oh my god! And they're like, no. And they tossed him aside. I'm like, oh my god, that was Andy Blankenbuehler's. But the irony of it, James, is if he had gotten the show, he would not have been able to choreograph In the Heights, which is what he won his first Tony for in 2008. That did strike me as well as sort of like how interesting this community is, and one door closes and another door opens. Oh, I really wanted to.
You never want to steal JB's thunder, because if you go back and watch our top 10 of 2018 film, I mentioned Widows early in the podcast, and normally the verbose JB, he says, oh yeah, that was a cool film. He's really oddly terse. Why? Because he was saving his thunder for the end, since Widows was his #1 pick. Then he got to expound on the show, but he didn't want to when I mentioned it.
I didn't want to telegraph.
He wanted to save some juice for the end. I understand that.
Keep people watching. By this point, I think they have turned our show off. So let me close things out. Our next indie, ladies and gentlemen, here's your trivia. We're going to continue doing 2009 indies. And the next one's interesting because In it, a porn star gets serious with a major director in our next indie. Our next up, however, is this Thursday. We're going to do our classic movie discussion. Alex and Jim will be with me to celebrate the 50th anniversary of The Wild Bunch, and that'll be just in a few days. In the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, this meeting of the No Name Cinema Society is adjourned.